Government always abides by the rule of law.
The rule of law.
The rule of law. This government will always respect the rule of law.
Unless it seems it's the EU divorce agreement you signed just over 7 months ago and really don't like.
Yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way.
That breach starkly underlined by the resignation of the government's most senior lawyer, Sir Jonathan Jones. Friends said he was very unhappy with the government breaching the treaty with the EU signed this year. So, it seems, was Theresa May.
The United Kingdom government signed the withdrawal agreement with the Northern Ireland Protocol. This Parliament voted that withdrawal agreement into UK legislation. The government is now changing the operation of that agreement. Given that, how can the government reassure future international partners that the UK can be trusted to abide by the legal obligations of the agreements it signs?
As a responsible government, we cannot allow businesses to not have certainty for January.
Theresa May seemed unimpressed, as were some who'd worked with Sir Jonathan Jones.
This is a very measured public servant who has a long record in the civil service, been an outstanding Treasury solicitor. He's not somebody I would expect to walk out of a job. And of course, if the Treasury solicitor is right in his own assessment of this, then the Attorney General is, I'm afraid, failing in her duty as the government's principal law officer to uphold the principles of the ministerial code and, above all, the absolute centrality of our international legal obligations.
There was no comment from the Attorney General, though a big welcome from the European Research Group of pro-Brexit Tory MPs she used to chair, and who said this is what they'd been expecting.
It's the basis of the understanding that many of us had when we supported the withdrawal agreement before the general election.
You were told they'd rewrite it a bit.
We said this was a barely tolerable agreement.
And you were assured it wouldn't end up that way. There'd be changes.
Well, it's not a question of just being assured. It is what Boris's intention has always been. And it's why
not how the EU understood.
Well, of course they're saying that, but to what extent is this a negotiating tactic?
The EU chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, in Brussels this morning, is in London tonight and has promised to ask the UK's chief negotiator face-to-face what Britain is up to. There may be a clue where the inspiration for this move came from a Dominic Cummings blog entry written last spring about Theresa May's draft Brexit deal. Don't worry about the so-called permanent commitments, he wrote. A serious government, one not cowed by officials and their bullshit legal advice with which they have herded ministers like sheep, will dispense with these commitments and any domestic law enforcing them. At lunchtime, the chief British negotiator was picking up the peerage Boris Johnson awarded him a few weeks ago.
I, David, Lord Frost, do swear by Almighty God that I will be
Lord Frost's first task this evening, explaining to the EU negotiating team why Britain is on its own admission considering breaking international law. Well, one of the things the government's been saying is that there's perfectly good precedent for this kind of action, and they've been pointing at the 2013 Finance Act, where treaties were overruled. George Osborne, in the last few minutes, the Chancellor at the time, has just comprehensively rubbished that, saying all the parties to the treaties back then were happy for the treaties concerned to be overridden. I won't go into the detail of all of that, but some incoming in the last few minutes there. The eighth round, the critical round of talks, is now underway in London. One of the people who it's been said has not been talking much about Brexit in recent times, despite a past intense interest, is the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Well, today he did invite people in to talk about that and other things. And when I caught up with him, I started by asking him about the resignation of the government's top lawyer.
I do know Jonathan Jones, and he's a first-class lawyer. And he would not have done this lightly. So it's obviously evidence that what the government's proposing is wrong.
That's quite a mild word compared to Theresa May today in the House. It's illegal, isn't it?
Well, it's wrong, but it also masks the real issue because in the national interest we need a deal. That's what the Prime Minister promised the British people. A deal's in the national interest. So what I say to the government is, don't reopen these arguments the public thought being closed a long time ago. Get on, negotiate a deal.
Do you think they want to put a bomb under this whole
I would be
process?
astonished if the public want these arguments reopened.
Well, what do you think the government's up to?
Well, maybe they're using it for leverage. I don't know.
You say the deal's in the national interest. Presumably you think this deal, which is so thin and so close to no deal, from your perspective, actually is a far cry from the national interest.
Well, it's in the national interest we have a deal.
Even if
it is a better outcome than no deal, and no deal would be a failure for this Prime Minister and for this government, and a failure that the Prime Minister will have to own. There's a deal to be had. Get on, get that deal over the line, and then let's concentrate on the job in hand.
It's very interesting you're using that formulation again and again. Let's get this done, refocus elsewhere. I mean, Brexit convulsed this country for a number of years. You were at the very centre of all of that. You might, at one point, have been a big force for joining support for Theresa May's deal, which would have been a very different deal, a deal you presumably think would be more in the national interest. Do you regret not throwing all your political weight behind that?
Well, look, we've been through a general election where Brexit was an issue. The Prime Minister...
I'm talking about before that. I'm talking about when Theresa May was there. This is a judgment call. Do you think you probably called it wrong back then and you shouldn't have been pining still for Remain, pining for a second referendum? You should have actually thrown your weight. You had quite a lot of weight under Jeremy Corbyn behind the Theresa May deal.
Look, I think that's all well-rehearsed history. We've been through a general election. We've been through a general election. We made our arguments clear in the general election. We lost.
Do you regret
The Prime Minister made his arguments in the general election, and he won. He said he'd get a good deal, an oven-ready deal. He needs to deliver on that. What I accept is that we have left the EU. What I accept is that the Leave-Remain argument is over.
It lurks still out there, though, that Remain-Leave division, doesn't it?
I don't think it does.
Well, you're picking up support, but you're not picking up support from Leavers.
We have left the EU.
You must know.
And the Leave-Remain debate is over.
At the moment, your position, last week at Prime Minister's Questions, you seem to be setting out a different position from the government, saying furlough should be extended for some sectors that are particularly hit. The Prime Minister seemed to be not going there. Is there any limit to how much you would spend if you were in his seat?
We're not saying that should be extended forever for all sectors. What we're saying is there should be a tailored approach now, because I think it's blindingly obvious that in some sectors, in some businesses, where because of social distancing you just can't get back to any degree of normality, those businesses will go under if they don't have a bit more support.
But that could be years. We could be talking about years of supporting, say, people in service sector, as you say, an airline pilot. You can't actually have an airline pilot sitting out work for years, can you? To take an extreme example.
Well, what we're saying is have a flexible approach. There will be different arguments for each sector. But just to say one size fits all support finishes on the same day, whether your business is more or less back to normal or whether it's never going to be back to normal, doesn't make sense.
The Prime Minister keeps trying to poke away at you on a couple of levels. One, you're a lawyer, a bit too smooth, perhaps. But also that you're the guy who stands there now as the man of principle, but served under Jeremy Corbyn, presumably disagreeing with vast tracts of what he was doing from this room.
Well, I think what the Prime Minister should
Which
do...
is it? Which is the real Keir Starmer?
What the Prime Minister should do at Prime Minister's Questions is to answer the questions.
But I'm asking you now. But fair enough about Prime Minister's Questions, but which is the real Keir Starmer?
Just let me finish, because the Prime Minister is just getting increasingly desperate. He started by attempting to answer the questions, and that didn't go well. Then he attempted to avoid all the questions, and now he's just going for insults. That's desperation. Yes, I served Jeremy Corbyn. He's leader of our party, and I thought that the arguments we had to make about the most important issue of the day, which was Brexit, had to be made. And
on the other ones, you were happy to keep quiet because that was the bigger cause at the time.
Well, look, I served in the shadow cabinet. That's there for all to see. But don't be distracted by that. This is a Prime Minister who, when he's asked a direct question that he can't answer, reaches for insults.
But you could be our Prime Minister, and people want to know, are you the sort of guy who keeps his head down when he just wants to keep the job, or are you the man of principle?
Well, I think it's very important to go back over the record. If you take an issue like anti-Semitism, for example, I was very loud and very clear in my criticism of what our party was not at the time doing. So, actually, I did speak out on these issues, but this is to play the Prime Minister's game, which is a desperate game of wanting to avoid scrutiny.
Keir Starmer talking to Gary Gibbon earlier today. Well, our business and global trade correspondent Paul McNamara has spent the day in Northern Ireland on the border in South Armagh near Newry. Paul, how are today's developments going down there?
As you can imagine, not well. I mean, you want a place that highlights why what's going on in Westminster is so important. This is it. Behind me, both north and south of the island of Ireland, people and goods moving freely between the two. The hill that we're on, overlooking it all, used to be home to a military watchtower, a reminder of a past nobody wants to return to. Now, up until 48 hours ago, people here thought the idea had been fudged through the withdrawal agreement. Goods could continue moving freely. The price of that, of course, is checks and some tariffs on goods moving from Northern Ireland to the mainland UK. The DUP, the main unionist party, have always had an issue with that. They hate the idea of Northern Ireland being treated differently in any way to any other part of the UK. They've treated this idea that parts of the withdrawal agreement could be overridden with cautious optimism. They've been burned before by Boris Johnson, so the message today has been, don't be too happy, let's see what actually comes out in the detail tomorrow. On the other hand, Sinn Féin are, unsurprisingly, spitting feathers.
Governments admitting that they're about to break the law, in my humble opinion, is not a small matter, particularly when it affects an international agreement which is less than 6 months old. And when you're in the middle of negotiations with the EU about what you want to do next in terms of reaching an agreement with them. So this is a huge matter. It's a significant problem, and it creates huge uncertainty in relation to how this government intends to move forward, not only with Brexit, but its commitments to the Good Friday Agreement.
Now, look, concerns over the Good Friday Agreement or commitments to it isn't just political rhetoric. You spend the day here, and we've heard it time and time again today, a real fear that a breakdown in negotiations caused by something like tomorrow's bill could ultimately lead to some sort of physical border. Now, Boris Johnson has always maintained that there won't be a physical border, that there are lots of benefits post-Brexit. After the last 48 hours, the message here, people are less convinced.
Thanks, Paul. Well, earlier I spoke to Sir Bob Neal, the Conservative MP who asked the question of Brandon Lewis that prompted the Northern Ireland Secretary's admission. I asked him what he thought of the reply he got.
Well, it was a straight answer, but I think it was a very troubling one, because I don't think, as a matter of principle, a country that prides itself on holding the rule of law as being central to the way it conducts its affairs should be contemplating breaching an international agreement which has been registered with the UN and has the force of international law. That would be immensely damaging, I think, for our reputation.
You sound pretty angry about this, are you?
I'm concerned about it because I believe that Britain has led the way in many respects in achieving advances in international law, in the rule of law, and in 50 years as a Conservative Party member, I've always believed in upholding the rule of law, and I don't think one should depart from that. And so I just want to make clear to the government that before we go too far down this route, there will be, I think, damaging consequences, and let's find another means of resolving what may well be a legitimate problem. I accept that, but this, in my judgment, isn't the right way to be going about it.
The government says that this is simply a safety net, a backstop, to coin a phrase, that might not even be needed. Does that reassure you at all?
Well, I hope that it isn't needed, of course, but I don't think it's a wise thing to announce that you're going to have a backstop which might potentially lead you to breach the law. So I don't think that's something that can be on the agenda as a backstop.
If Number 10 presses ahead with this, will you vote against this measure in the bill that's coming up tomorrow?
Well, I want, first of all, the bill is only going to be laid, as I understand it, for its first reading. Let's see the text, and it will have to be considered, and there'll be chances for amendments. So I want to find a constructive way forward with the government for this. But at the end of the day, it's like any contract. You enter into a contract, sometimes it turns out the contract that you signed is inconvenient. But that doesn't give you an excuse, just unilaterally, to go and renege on part of the contract. Now, I don't think any British government really wants to do that, but let's make sure we don't fall into that situation.
Given the scale of your unease and the scale of other people's unease, not least the former Prime Minister, Theresa May, do you think the Attorney General and the Justice Secretary should consider their position?
We haven't yet again seen the text, so I'm not going to get in front of myself in respect of those matters. They're honourable people, and I'm sure that they will act properly in accordance with the oaths of office that they took.
And just finally, you've been talking about 50 years as a Conservative member. How surprised are you that your party appears to be going down this route?
Well, I'm surprised. I'm disappointed, and that's why I hope that we'll find a means of making sure that doesn't happen, if that is indeed the route that is intended. That's why I want to see the text, but since we had an important set of questions today, I wanted to flag up certain things which are matters of principle for a number of people.
Sir Bob Neill, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.